Hello out there. It's a special Saturday live stream. Who will join? Will anyone join? Oh, I'm going to close this door real quick. Oh, that looks better. All right, we have, figured we'd do this on a Saturday. You know, we don't always do program on the weekends, but thought maybe people are out there today, want to talk some politics, want to talk some law. So thank you for joining in. I'm going to let a few more people join in, but welcome everyone who has joined us today. Feel free to say hi if you'd like while we're waiting for others to join. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the appeals court ruling against President Trump's travel ban. And hi Alice, how are you? Hi Rulon. And specifically, what I want to do today is I want to talk very specifically about what a flaw I see in the specific ruling. And I haven't seen this specifically mentioned in the coverage I've seen. I've seen a lot of different coverage, but the ruling itself is quite specific, and I want to talk about a very specific problem that I think affects the ruling. So welcome all of you for joining me. Why don't I get into it? Why don't I start? I'm going to start right now. I take a little drink of water, then I'm going to start. So I want to take this ruling and explain to you a problem I think that is with this ruling. So this ruling is the ruling that the appeals court gave a couple days ago. And what they were ruling on is whether it's a federal judge had put a temporary restraining order on President Trump's travel ban. And this, the appeals court was trying to figure out, hey, did the judge make a mistake or not? Because the government said that there should not be a temporary restraining order on the travel ban. And the appeals court was trying to figure out whether the temporary restraining order should be allowed to stand or whether the temporary restraining order should be done away with. And they gave a very specific argument in their decision. So I've been flipping through their decision here. So what I did the last couple days is I was interested in, I saw the stuff on TV and I saw the coverage, in different print publications, but I really want to see for myself, what exactly did they say in this decision? And when I read the decision, I saw that it was on a very specific point and I had a problem with the decision. So I want to explain that to you now. So the first thing to recognize about the appeals court decision is it basically says President Trump's side loses for this one reason. So what President Trump's side in this case had to show is, at this point in the case, and once there's been a temporary restraining order put on, what it then falls to President Trump's side to do is to show that they have a likely chance, when it goes to court, of winning the case. And the case they would win is that the travel ban is legal. So basically, in short, and this is said in the court's own ruling, the burden is on President Trump's side, which is the Justice Department, to show that it is likely the case that they have a likely chance of winning when the court actually decides, is the travel ban legal or not? And if they can't do that, then they lose the appeal. So what the appeals court said is, this is what they said. They said, the basic idea of their ruling is that President Trump's side, the Justice Department, has not convinced us that they are likely to show the travel ban is legal, that they're likely to win that case in court. Therefore, their appeal fails. And they have a very specific reason, they say, that President Trump's team at the Justice Department has failed to show they're likely to win at court. So the specific reason is that President Trump's side hasn't shown that it's likely that they'll win on this specific point. The appeals court said in their ruling that they think that they are sympathetic with the state of Washington's argument that the Trump travel ban violates the Due Process Clause. I'll explain this a little more in detail. But basically they said, the state of Washington has put forward this good argument that the Trump travel ban violates the Due Process Clause of the Constitution. Hey, Justice Department, you haven't convinced us that it doesn't violate the Due Process Clause. Therefore, it's not likely that you're going to win in court and prove in a case that decides whether the travel ban is legal. Therefore, you lose the appeal. And I'll read you the specific part of the appeals court decision. So again, the appeals court decision is it's not like, because you might remember the state of Washington, when they initially filed this lawsuit against the Trump's travel ban executive order, they gave like a bunch of different arguments. They said as to why the travel ban was illegal. They said it violates the due process clause. It violates the establishment clause. It violates the equality under the law clause. And also, I think they said it was a violation of the Immigration and Naturalization Act. So they gave all these reasons that they said that Trump's travel ban, there should be a temporary restraining order put on it, and why they didn't think it was legal. In the appeals court ruling, they didn't deal with all those arguments. They just dealt with in terms of, they talked about some of the other ones, but what the basis of this ruling is that we think the Trump administration hasn't shown that they're likely to win in court because it seems fairly likely that, I'm speaking roughly here, but it seems fairly likely to us that when a court decides, they will find that the Trump travel ban violates the Due Process Clause. So the ruling itself is only based on this question, whether the Trump travel ban violates the Due Process Clause of the Constitution, and whether the Justice Department, arguing for the Trump administration, has shown that they are likely to win on this point. And the court says, no, you haven't shown us that it's likely the case that a court will say, no, your travel ban doesn't violate the Due Process Clause. So it's all about the Due Process Clause. That's what this ruling really comes down to. It's all about the Due Process Clause. This ruling, here's the front page. So that's what it is. And just on page 19 of the court decision, you can go yourself, the appeals court decision, they actually say, the government has not shown that it is likely to the government has not shown that it is likely to succeed on appeal on its arguments about, at least, the state's Due Process Clause claim. And then they also go on to say, and we also note the serious nature of the allegations the states have raised with respect to religious discrimination claims. We express no view as to any of the state's other claims. So this whole thing comes down to the Due Process Clause. The appeals court itself says, we don't think you've shown that your travel ban doesn't violate the Due Process Clause. And then they also say, and maybe it violates the Establishment Clause, but we're not really going to talk about that much here. And they say, and we're not even going to talk about the other stuff at all. So this appeals court ruling is it's narrowly focused on whether the Trump side, the Justice Department, has made a good case that their travel ban does not violate the Due Process Clause. So that's what this comes down to. So if anyone says something to you like, oh, the appeals court has ruled against Trump, and they have argued that Trump was anti-Muslim, and that's why they ruled against him, they're wrong. That did not play a role in this ruling. This ruling is just about whether the court thinks that that roughly speaking, whether the travel ban violates the Due Process Clause, and whether they think the Trump camp has made a good argument that it doesn't violate the Due Process Clause. So let's focus on that narrow question as to whether the travel ban violates the Due Process Clause, and why the appeals court thinks it's likely that a court would rule it does violate this clause. And they give specific reasoning for this. And this is where I find the big flaw in the argument. So let me say a little about this Due Process Clause. I should say something about that. The due process clause is a clause in the Constitution. It's the Fifth Amendment, I believe. And what the due process clause says is that the federal government cannot deprive someone of life, liberty, or property without due process. And what due process means is certain procedures that people think by fairness they have a right to if the government's going to deprive them of life, liberty, or property. So, for example, due process might involve, the government, before they're going to take your property away or throw you in jail, needs to tell you why they're doing it, needs to tell you in advance that they're going to do it, needs to give you a chance to respond, needs to have give you a chance to attend some kind of hearing where you say, hey, I think you're wrong in taking this stuff away from me, here's why, I didn't commit this crime, or, I did pay my taxes. And so, all these are parts of due process as understood by the courts. It's the government can't take away your life, liberty, or property without going through certain procedures. And as I said, those could involve letting you know they're going to do it, giving you a chance to respond, having a hearing with a neutral arbitrator, some kind of neutral party who hears your argument and then decides whether the government's really right to take that stuff away. So that's what the due process clause says. And there's this question of whether Trump's travel ban violates the due process clause. Now, I think the stronger part of the argument against that it does violate the due process clause in certain ways is that it violates it for certain people. So remember, the Trump travel ban is supposed to apply to various groups of people, and the way it was written, it applies not only to people who've never lived here and might be coming here in the future. It applies to people who already have visas who are staying here, and those are temporary passes to stay here. The government said you're okay to stay here for a short amount of time. That's roughly speaking, what a visa is. And people who hold green cards, that's a longer term thing where green cards can say up to 10 years. They can say, you're cool, you're a lawful permanent resident for 10 years, and I think you can even renew them or whatever. But that's a green card is long-term approval of the government to be in this country. But the travel ban as written applied to not only people who've never lived here, but lawful permanent residents and lawful long-term residents of this country. And the state of Washington made this case, and I think there's something to be said for this case, that when the government with this travel ban said, hey, people with green cards, if you're out of the country right now, you can't come back in. And if you leave the country, you can't come back in. It was for people from certain countries. So to clarify, there were those 7 countries, the 7 predominantly Muslim countries, this specific part of the travel ban it applied to. And it said anyone from those countries, anyone who's a citizen of those countries, cannot enter this country. So that meant that if you're from, say, Iran, and you had a green card to be here, and you were visiting home, you couldn't get back in the country. Because you were a citizen of that country. And so there's an argument to be made, and the state of Washington made this argument, that the due process rights of green card holders were violated by the travel ban. Why? Well, the travel ban took away, remember, the due process says the government can't take away life, liberty, or property without going through certain procedures. And the travel ban, the argument says, took away a certain liberty of green card holders, which is to travel to and from this country, to leave and come back in. And it didn't give them notice. It didn't give them a heads up. Just all of a sudden, one day, this travel ban came out and said, hey, if you're out of the country, green card holders, tough luck, you can't get back in. So the green card holders could say, well, if you're going to take that right away from me, that liberty away from me, you got to at least follow procedure, due process. You got to give me a heads up it's going to happen. You got to allow me to go to a hearing and state my case why I think this is unfair or whatever. So I do think there's an argument to be made, and this is something other people have said too, that, for example, green card holders, their this travel ban didn't respect their due process. But that's not my beef with this ruling. So the Justice Department, when they talked to the appeals court, when they gave their arguments to the appeals court, both in written and spoken form, they basically said, look, roughly speaking, they said, look, okay, maybe it's the case that this violates the due process of, people who have green cards or people with visas. But if that's the case, then the temporary restraining order should only apply to those people. But clearly, the Justice Department said, clearly, people who aren't in this country, people who don't have a visa, people who don't have a green card, people who haven't even tried to come to this country yet, we're not violating their due process when we pass this travel ban because they don't have due process rights. The Constitution only gives due process rights to people who are like citizens of the U.S. or legal permanent residents of the U.S., like people who are in this country. It doesn't give due process rights to people outside the country. So the administration's argument was, one of their arguments was like, look, even if the temporary restraining order, you're going to put this temporary restraining order and you're going to apply it to and you're going to say the travel ban shouldn't apply to people with green cards and people with visas, people who are lawful permanent residents. The travel ban should still apply to people who haven't been in this country yet and aren't legally admitted to this country yet because they don't have any. More specifically, the Justice Department would say the travel ban does not violate the due process rights of these people who've never been to this country and live in these other countries because they don't have due process rights because the Constitution doesn't apply to them. It doesn't give them due process rights. So, and if you go and you can read the government's argument online, you can read their brief and whatever, they make this argument. So the appeals court disagreed with that, though. And the appeals court, so that's what the government would say. The government would say, look, if we're just talking about due process, it's clear to us that the travel ban does not violate due process rights when it comes to these people who are not already in the country, when it comes to people who just live in these other countries and don't have a visa and don't have a green card or whatever. And so clearly the government would say, clearly we think a court would see that. And clearly that shows that when a court decides whether the travel ban is legal, they're going to at least decide, it's at least very likely that a court will say the travel ban does not violate the due process rights of future immigrants to this country who are not already in this country. That's the government's argument. So the government would say that's an argument that shows it's likely that the travel ban will be shown to be legal for non-residents, non-lawful permanent residents, or non-lawful residents already of this country in a court. So now the appeals court said, we don't buy your argument, government. Remember, the appeals court, their appeal ruling said, hey, government, it's likely to be ruled in court that your travel ban violates the due process rights of not just people already in the country, not just green card holders and visa holders, but basically everyone. All these people, so all these people in these other countries who live there and haven't come here yet. All right, so I should be more clear here. The government, the appeals court thinks that the travel ban likely violates due process rights in a way such that it should not even be applied to people who aren't in this country already and people who say live in Iraq now or live in Sudan now. So how does it make this argument? Because we just heard that the federal government seems to have a pretty good argument that the travel ban doesn't violate due process when it's applied to people without green cards and visas who just live right now in countries like Iraq and Sudan and Iran and places like that. And their argument is those people don't have due process rights. The Constitution doesn't give rights to people who are citizens of Iran. It gives rights to people who are citizens here and also lawful permanent residents here, but not people who live in other countries. So why does the appeals court not buy that argument? Because they don't, and that's a big part of their ruling, that they don't buy that argument of the government's. Why does the appeals court not buy that? Well, specifically say this, and I'm going on page 22 of the appeals court ruling. And they say, they first, in the appeals court ruling, they first talk about how they think that, like, the travel ban violates the due process rights of people with green cards and, like, people with visas and that kind of stuff. And it's like, fine. They say all that. And then they acknowledge, though, they say, but the government says, the travel ban should be allowed to stand for people who don't have green cards and don't have visas because it doesn't violate any due process rights. And they say this. So what they say is they say that even this, I'm reading from page 22, even if the claims based on the due process rights of lawful permanent residents were no longer part of this case, the states would continue to have potential claims regarding possible due process rights of other persons who are in the United States, even if lawfully, non-immigrant visa holders who have been in the United States but temporarily departed or wish to temporarily depart, refugees, and applicants who have a relationship with a U.S. resident or an institution that might have rights of its own to assert. So let's slow down for a second. The appeals court here is arguing that when the travel ban is applied to people who live in other countries, who don't live in this country, who haven't been to this country, who are not lawful residents of this country, the states still have a good argument that that part of the travel ban violates due process rights. Now, you might wonder, how can they argue this? How can they argue that if there's a travel ban on people who, like, are living in Iraq right now and are from Iraq and have never been to this country, how does that violate due process rights? What the state argued and what the court is supporting in this and saying is a good argument in this ruling is that by prohibiting people who live in these other countries from coming to America in the future, the travel ban violates the due process rights of American citizens. Let me say that again. The appeals court is being sympathetic with the state of Washington's argument, and that argument is that a travel ban on people who live in other countries and are coming to this country, want to come to this country, violates the due process rights of people who live in this country. And you might wonder, wait a second, how can it be that if President Trump, like, say, forbids people from Iran from coming to this country, forbids citizens in Iran from coming to this country for the next, 120 days, how does that violate due process rights of American citizens? So the basic argument that the state of Washington made is the state of Washington said something like, look, let's take one of our colleges, or and not just American citizens, American citizens. Take somebody who lives in the state of Washington. And they're Iranian. They're originally from Iran. They came here, but they came here legally. And they have family still in Iran. And that family wants to come and visit them. They have it's a liberty of theirs to have their family come and visit them. But you've taken this liberty away from them when you've passed this travel ban. Basically, what's happened is when you pass this travel ban, you say, hey, person who lives in Washington with relatives in Iran, you no longer have the freedom to have these people come and visit you. And the person in Washington would say, now, you've done that without due process. You took away one of my liberties, but the Constitution says you can't take away my liberty without due process. And so, at the very least, you should have said, hey, people in Washington, just a heads up, like a month from now, we're going to pass this travel ban. And in a month from now, we're going to pass this travel ban and your relatives won't be able to visit you anymore. And also, if you have a problem with that, here we're going to have a hearing and you can come to this hearing and make your case and a neutral arbiter will hear this hearing and decide on it. So that's an example of how the state of Washington argued that President Trump's travel ban violated the due process rights of its residents. They said, like, hey, this travel ban didn't give any heads up to our residents, and it took away our residents' liberty to, like, have their relatives come and visit them from these 7 countries. And another way they said it was a violation of due process rights is the state owns colleges, and arguably, this is the state of Washington's argument. They've hurt the property of they've damaged the property of the state, being its colleges, because like the travel ban prevented, say, somebody who they wanted to hire, say University of Washington State, which is owned by Washington, wanted to hire some professor who lives in Iraq. They can't have that professor come here anymore, at least for the next few months. And therefore, in some sense, they've I don't know if you want to say they took property away from the state of Washington because they lessened the value of its property, or they interfered with the state of Washington's liberty to have its college hire who they want. And they did this without due process. They didn't say, hey, state of Washington, hey, colleges in the state of Washington owned by the state of Washington, we're going to prevent you from hiring these people, but we're not going to give you a heads up. We're going to do it in advance, and we're not going to let you complain about it in a hearing and that kind of thing. So this is the state of Washington's argument. These are the kind of arguments the state of Washington gives, that when the travel ban applies to people who don't even live here and don't even have a visa or green card, people who just live in these other Muslim countries, predominantly Muslim countries, that violates due process, because the state of Washington would say it violates the due process rights of people who live in our state, people who live in Washington, and like our universities that we own. It violates their due process rights because it's taking away their liberty or their property, and it didn't give them due process before doing so. It didn't give them a heads up. It didn't let them respond. It didn't give them a full reason why. There are various arguments they could make why it violated their due process rights. Now, what the federal government wants to argue in this case, the federal government wants to argue, this is just crazy. The federal government wants to argue the residents of Washington don't have due process rights that are violated when we say people from Iran can't come here for the next few months because of security reasons. The government, the federal government, the Trump administration, represented by the Justice Department, does not think that, they think it's clear that the travel ban does not violate the due process rights of Washington residents and the state of Washington and Washington schools and stuff like that, because they think no due process rights are being violated here. What they think is happening is basically, it's not like the federal government went to a person in Washington and took their TV out of their apartment. That would, in that case, if the federal government went tomorrow and took the TV out of people in Washington, the TV out of their apartments, that would be depriving them of property. And the federal government can't do that without going through due process. But the federal government would say, we didn't directly deprive you of anything. We took this national security action of passing this travel ban to keep certain people out of this country. And sure, that had some indirect effect on you, like so you can't now get visited by your family, or you can't hire who you want at your school for the next few months. But that's not a deprivation of your life, liberty, and property that the Constitution is designed to protect, and the Constitution is that the Due Process Clause was put in the Constitution to apply to. So, again, the federal government will say, okay, I guess maybe in some indirect way, like our travel ban, when it prevents people from like Iraq and Iran and these other countries from coming here, I guess you could argue that it somewhat restricts your liberty if you live in Washington in an indirect way, because I guess now you're not free to have your family come visit you. I guess if you want to say that, it's in some sense a violation of your liberty or a restriction of your liberty. But they're going to say that's not the kind of case, the deprivation of life, liberty, or property that the Due Process Clause is designed to apply to. The Due Process Clause is designed to apply to when the government throws you in jail or takes some of your property away or like executes you. It's supposed to say in those cases the government has to grant due process. It's got to like give you a heads up it's going to do it and let you respond and have a hearing about it and that kind of thing. But it's not the case that any time the government does anything at all, which doesn't have anything directly to do with you at all, that if that affects you in some little negative way, or even some big negative way, but if it somehow has this indirect effect on you, that in some way could, I guess, restrict your freedom in some way, that you have a due process, that due process applies, and the government had to give you a heads up. So that's what the government would say, is that, and I think there's definitely something to that, because so much the government does that doesn't have to directly do with individual citizens is, of course, going to have indirect effects on a lot of citizens. And I don't believe the due process clause was designed so that any person, even indirectly affected by any government action, had a right to due process. The due process clause, to me, and many people in the Supreme Court, many judges have argued this, is meant to apply, and Scalia definitely argued this point, it's meant to apply to actions where the government directly deprives an American citizen or a lawful American resident of life, liberty, or property. And in those cases, the due process clause applies. So I do think there is a very strong argument that the government could give, and did give. They gave this argument that the part of the travel ban that applies to people who live in other countries, not green card holders, not visa holders, people who live in other countries and haven't come here yet, that part of the travel ban does not violate the due process clause, because obviously these people who live there don't have due process rights on their own. And the due process clause is not designed to protect, like, the rights of, it's not supposed to apply to people who live in this country when the government takes some action toward people in another country. That's just a wrong reading of the due process clause. So to me, if the appeals court is going to argue, and they have to argue this is a big part of their ruling, if the appeals court is going to argue that the federal government doesn't have a good argument here, if the appeals court is going to argue that the travel ban, the temporary restraining order should apply to the travel ban when it's applied to everybody, that the temporary restraining order shouldn't be lifted for the part of the travel ban applying to people who live in other countries. If they're going to argue that, they need to show that the state of Washington was right, or at least there's a good chance a court will find them right, and that the state of Washington's argument has merit. And again, the state of Washington's argument was that when the travel ban says, hey, people from other countries, you can't come in here for the next few months, that violates the due process rights of American residents. That's what the state of Washington was arguing. So, and as I said before, it seems like a very good case could be made that it doesn't violate those rights, because not every action the government does. Again, long story short, the government's action was not directed at these people in the state of Washington. And just because it indirectly affects them in some way doesn't mean they have due process rights. And it is at least plausible to interpret the due process clause as not applying in that kind of case. So how, you might ask, did the appeals court, why did they end up saying, hey, federal government, you don't have a good argument here. We think, federal government, that the travel ban probably does violate the due process rights of American citizens, even when the travel ban is applied to, like, people who live in Iran and Iraq and Sudan and places like that, who never have come here before. So, to me, there's a big burden on the appeals court to argue in their ruling that people in this country's due process rights are violated when the travel ban says people from other countries can't come here. That claim is not like an obvious claim, and if the appeals court's going to rely on that claim, which is an important part of their argument, important part of their ruling, they need to defend that claim. And this, to me, is where the big flaw in the appeals court decision is. They do not adequately defend this claim that when the travel ban is applied to people who live in other countries, it violates the due process rights of Washington residents, state of Washington residents. And the entire way, the defense of this claim that the appeals court gives, that's like the key to their whole ruling. Because again, if they can't defend this claim, then at the very least, they should take the temporary restraining order off for the parts of the travel ban that don't apply to green card holders and don't apply to visa holders, and that apply to people who live in other countries and aren't lawful permanent residents here. So this claim is key to the appeals court ruling, because if they can't defend this claim, then the travel ban should be allowed to stand for most of the people it's supposed to apply to, these people who haven't come to the country yet. So this is a key claim in the appeals court ruling, very key claim, and they defend it very briefly and in a way I think is totally inadequate. So how does the appeals court defend their claim that when the travel ban says, hey, people from other countries, you can't come here for the next few months, that violates the due process rights of American citizens? How does it defend that claim? Well, I'm going to tell you how it does. There are only two places it defends this claim, and in two very short parts of this ruling, pages 22 and 23. And just so you know, the entire part of this ruling, which deals with the due process clause, which is the whole key part of the ruling, is only 5 pages long. So it's not a big argument here. But here's where they defend it. There's two places where they defend it. And the sum total of the appeals court's defense of their claim that the travel ban, when it applies to people who don't live in this country, violates the due process rights of people who do live in this country. Their entire argument for that claim is citing two other Supreme Court decisions. That's their entire argument. Now, just to get very nitpicky here, there's this other part where they say that the travel ban shouldn't apply to refugees. The travel ban shouldn't apply to refugees because, and then it says see 8 U.S. Code 1231, Note 8, and that to me, so I am not reading that part as part of their defense of this claim that the travel ban, when it applies to other people outside this country, violates due process rights of people in this country. So if you have an issue with that specific sentence, email me and I'll tell you why I don't think that's meant to support this claim. But anyways, if I don't want to go down that road because that'll be like 20 minutes of just really nitpickiness. I want to stick with what I'm trying to show now. What I'm arguing now is that the appeals court's ruling depends on this really, really bigly on this claim that when the travel ban is applied to people who don't live in this country, it violates due process rights of people who live in this country. And I think they have not adequately defended that claim. And I say they do not adequately defend this claim because the only defense of that claim that they give in this ruling is they point to two other Supreme Court cases, and they barely discuss the cases. They just point to two other cases, and they basically say, hey, because of the precedent set by these two other cases, that shows that the travel ban, when it applies to people who live outside this country and haven't come into this country yet, violates the due process rights of people in this country. So what are these two court cases that they cite? The two court cases they mention, and I'm going off of this, all happens on the bottom half of page 22 and the bottom half of page 23 of their ruling, so feel free to check it yourself. The two cases they cite are Kerry versus Din, and Kerry versus Din is a 2015 case the Supreme Court ruled on, and Kleindienst versus Mandel, and that's a 1972 case. Kleindienst versus Mandel. And so on page 22 they cite those two cases, and on page 23 they cite Kerry versus Din. So the whole, and the discussion is very brief, and I'll talk about it in a minute, but the whole argument the appeals court gives that the travel ban, when applied to people who live outside this country, violates the due process rights of people who live in this country, is that, well, there's these two other Supreme Court cases, and that pretty much that shows that it probably, deprives them of their rights based on what those two other cases said. So what I did, I was a little suspicious, and I wanted to just know what their argument was. So I went and I read the decisions of those two cases. You can go get those decisions online, Kerry versus Din and Kleindienst versus Mandel, and I actually looked at the Supreme Court decisions and saw what they said. And when I read them, it became clear to me that these two decisions don't actually give the appeals court good support. That these two decisions don't actually strongly support the claim that when the travel ban is applied to people who live outside this country, it violates the due process rights of people who do live in this country. And I want to tell you why these two Supreme Court decisions don't strongly support that claim. So first off, let's talk about Kerry versus Din. So Kerry versus Din is one of the only two cases that the appeals court says supports their claim that the travel ban violates the due process rights of American citizens when it's applied to people who don't live in this country. Now, they say, basically, on page 23, there's like a single sentence where the appeals court says something like, well, in Kerry versus Din, 6 justices, what they roughly say is 6 of the 9 justices said something in Kerry versus Din which supports our view. That's what they said. But I looked at Kerry versus Din, and that's not true. So Kerry versus Din, this was a case where this person with the last name Din, who lived here, had married a guy who lived in Afghanistan. And so once she married this guy who lived in Afghanistan, this person Din, with the last name Din, wanted that guy to be able to move here. And I guess they tried to get like expedited screening for him here because he was now married to an American citizen. And the federal government, that's Kerry, Secretary of State Kerry, that's why it's Kerry versus Din. The federal government ultimately denied the visa request of her husband to move here. And it's because there's a specific part of the U.S. Code which says the government can forbid anybody from coming to this country if they've participated in some sort of terrorist activity. And the government claimed that that's what they said. So they told this woman, hey, we're not going to let your husband in because he's violated because of this code. And the code they cited, they told her what the specific law they were citing was, and that law was the one that said the government can prevent anybody from coming into this country if they've participated in some terrorist activity. And Din, this woman, said, you violated my due process rights. Why? She said, well, I have a liberty to have my husband live in the same country as me. By denying him entry to this country, you've taken that liberty away from me. The Constitution says you can't take liberty away from me unless you give me due process. And you haven't given me due process because you haven't really told me why this is happening. You gave a really brief explanation why this was happening. You said, oh, well, it's because of this law. But you haven't given a full explanation. You haven't had a hearing. You haven't allowed me to make my case at this hearing. So Din, this woman, claimed that her due process rights were violated by the government when the government said your husband can't come in here because we have this law that says people who participate in terrorist activities can be denied a visa. So that's what Din said. And I believe the original court, the district court, said, or one of the lower courts said, yeah, she's right, her due process rights were violated. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled that against Din. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled against the federal government and said due process rights had not been violated here. So, now let me break down. Remember, the government, the appeals court that just ruled against Trump is claiming that Kerry versus Din supports the claim that when the travel ban says, hey, people from other countries, you can't come in here, that violates the due process rights of American citizens. So, and they say 6 of the 9 judges in Kerry versus Din, what they said supports that claim. But what did the Supreme Court justices in Kerry versus Din actually say? Well, 3 justices in the majority, Scalia and 2 others, it was Scalia, I have it written down here, Scalia, Roberts, and Thomas said that woman Din, she does not have due process rights in this case. Fine, she married a guy in Afghanistan. Fine, the government said, guy in Afghanistan, you can't come here. But these 3 justices, Scalia, Thomas, and Roberts, said, when the government says, hey, guy in Afghanistan, you come in here, they're not taking the liberty away of the guy's wife who lives here. They're not taking away, they call it a protected liberty interest. So they're not taking away a liberty that's protected by the due process clause. So basically, according to those 3 justices, when the government says you can't come in here to somebody, that doesn't mean they're not violating the due process clause of an American citizen who might be connected to that person. So those 3 judges said, like, that woman Din it was not the case that her liberty was violated and she has due process because of the due process clause. So those 3 justices, their ruling, and they were in the majority, clearly doesn't support the appeals court ruling against Trump. So that's 3. That's 3 of them. 3 of the 9, what they said in Kerry versus Din, clearly does not support the appeals court. Now, 2 other justices in the majority. So the majority in Kerry versus Din was 5 people. 3 of them I just talked about. Who were the other 2? The other 2 were Kennedy and Alito. And Kennedy and Alito, they're very clear about this in their decision. They say, we are going to take no opinion. We take no stand on whether Din, this woman, had due process rights that were violated in this case. What they rule, Kennedy and Alito, what their ruling was if we assume that Din had due process rights that were violated in this case, if we assume that, we don't know that, and we're not taking an opinion on that, we're not taking a stance on that, but let's just assume for the sake of argument that this woman Din had her due process rights violated when the government didn't let her husband in. They say, well, even if she did have due process rights that were violated. What I should clarify. I said something incorrect. What Alito and Kennedy said is, let's assume that this was a violation of her liberty in a way that she does have due process rights. Okay, so I should correct myself. The 2 other people in the majority, Kennedy and Alito, they said, we're not going to rule on whether she had due process rights at all. We're just going to say, if she does have due process rights, if that were the case, they weren't violated in this case. Because what Kennedy and Alito say is, when the government said to this woman Din, we're not letting your husband in the country from Afghanistan because this specific law says, we can forbid anybody from entering the country if they've been involved in terrorist activity. When the government said that to Din, they fulfilled due process. So Kennedy and Alito said, look, if we assume that Din had due process rights here because her husband who lives in Afghanistan was kept out of the country, her due process rights were not violated. But Kennedy and Alito said very specifically, we are not going to take a stance on whether Din has due process rights here. So we now have 5 judges in the majority in Kerry versus Din. 3 of them say when the government keeps Din's husband who lives in Afghanistan out of this country, that in no way, Din has no due process argument to make because due process doesn't apply to her in this case. 3 judges say that. 2 judges say, well, we're not going to take a stand on whether when the government keeps Din's husband in Afghanistan says you can't come in the country, whether that violates the due process rights of Din, who lives in America, who's an American citizen. So I just told you about 5 of the judges. The majority of the judges' decisions did not support the claim that when America does something, and they do something directly affecting like somebody who lives in another country, and it has an indirect effect on somebody living here, the person living here has due process rights relevant to that. So 5 of the 9 said either Din has no due process rights when the government keeps her husband out, and keeps the husband from coming into the country, or that Din, even if she, or they say either she has no due process rights, or we're not going to take a stance on whether she has due process rights. So it's just wrong for the appeals court to say Kerry versus Din supports their claim that when the travel ban keeps people out of this country who live in another country, the people connected to those people in the other countries who live in this country have due process rights. Kerry versus Din does not support that. The majority of justices in Kerry versus Din did not support this claim. So it's just sloppiness. And they said, to me, what they did is what the appeals court ruling did, if you want to get technical, is they misread what Kennedy and Alito said. And they were implying that what Kennedy and Alito said in the Kerry versus Din suggests that that people in this country have due process rights when the federal government does something to somebody in another country that affects the people in this country. But Kennedy and Alito didn't say that. So I have just explained to you why one of the 2 cases that the appeals court ruling cites doesn't actually, as supporting its claim, doesn't actually support its claim. So to rehash here, I just want to take a second and explain what the big picture is here. For the appeals court to successfully say, hey, the travel ban, the appeals court gave an argument why the travel ban, why the temporary restraining order should be in effect even for people, even when the travel ban is applied to people who don't live in this country and don't have green cards and don't have visas. And their argument for making this claim that the travel ban should be applied to everybody still and the temporary restraining order shouldn't be partially lifted, their argument is that, well, when the travel ban applies to people who live like in Iran and Iraq and Syria and these places, and when it keeps them out of the country, that this travel ban violated the due process rights of people who live in America. And their entire support for this claim, this very important claim in their ruling, a key claim in their ruling, was to cite 2 previous Supreme Court decisions, Kerry versus Din and Kleindienst versus Mandel. And I just explained to you why Kerry versus Din doesn't actually support the appeals court here. So one of the 2 cases they cited as supporting this really important claim in their ruling doesn't actually support them. Okay, now let's move on to Kleindienst versus Mandel. Does Kleindienst versus Mandel really support the appeals court's claim here? Let's look at what Kleindienst versus Mandel actually said. So Kleindienst versus Mandel, this was a case in 1972, and the basic idea of this case was there was this Belgian academic dude who people in America had invited to speak in this country. And the federal government, at the time, there was a rule that says you can't come into this country if you've written in support of certain things, like in certain forms of communism, or if you, roughly speaking, if you have like public writing supporting communism, you can't come into this country. And this guy, this academic guy, had written stuff publicly which was like supporting of communism. So the rule said this person couldn't come into the country. Now, I believe it was the Secretary of State at the time. The State Department had the right to waive this law for this guy and let this guy come into this country and speak in this country, do these speeches. But the Department of State said no. we are not letting this person in the country. We're not going to waive the law that applies to them for this case. So this academic is not going to be allowed to speak in this country. And what happened is there was a suit brought against the Department of State, which said, the people in this country, you violated their due process rights. Why? Because people in this country have a liberty to have this Belgian guy come and speak in this country. And when you say, Belgian guy, you can't come into this country, you are taking away, you're depriving people in this country of a certain liberty they have of having that guy come here to speak. And once you deprive somebody in this country of liberty, a resident of this country with liberty, of their liberty, well, the due process clause applies. And the people in this country, the argument would be, well, you've said this person can't come speak here. You've therefore deprived people in this country of liberty, but you haven't gone through due process in doing so. You didn't have a hearing. You didn't tell them in advance. You didn't give them an opportunity to respond, blah, blah, blah. So that was the lawsuit. That was roughly speaking, that was like what the general idea of this lawsuit was, is whether, and so that was, and the issue was, and so there was this issue of whether the government was legal. The big issue in this case was, was it legal for the government to keep this person from speaking in this country? But I should point out, what's relevant for us here is, did Kleindienst versus Mandel, did this case support the appeals court ruling against Trump? And specifically speaking, does this case, Kleindienst versus Mandel, does the Supreme Court ruling in that case support the appeals court's claim that the travel ban, when it keeps people who live in other countries from coming to this country, violates the due process rights of some people who live in this country? Does Kleindienst versus Mandel support that part of the appeals court argument? And here's the thing. So I read this ruling, and this ruling doesn't support the appeals court in their ruling against Trump. Why am I saying this? Well, I have my notes here, and I just need to refresh my memory for a second so I don't lead you astray. But basically, Kleindienst versus Mandel says it's not going to take a stance on whether people in this country have due process rights that are violated when the government takes an action towards somebody in another country. So what Kleindienst versus Mandel did is it says, suppose that people in this country, suppose the people in this country did have some kind of due process right when the government didn't let that guy come speak here from another country. If that were the case, in this specific case, would those due process rights have been violated? And does the court have the power to decide this and address this disagreement, address this conflict of rights between the due process rights of people who want to hear the guy come and speak and the rights of the government to control who comes in the country? So, Kleindienst versus Mandel, again, specifically says that it does not take a specific view on whether the people living in this country have due process rights that when the government says, hey, person in another country, you can't come here and speak. Now, if Kleindienst versus Mandel said that, it would support the appeals court ruling. But it doesn't say that. It says, if these people living in this country have due process rights, when the government says somebody from the other country can't come and speak to them, it talks about, well, if they have these rights, here's what we think the court is allowed to do or not. But it doesn't say they have due process rights when somebody they want to hear speak from another country is kept out. So Kleindienst versus Mandel also does not support the appeals court on this point. So let me summarize again the big picture here. The travel ban, when it went to the appeals court had the option of lifting the temporary restraining order for part of the travel ban. And it's as I understand it, the appeals court could have said, like, look, we think, and all right, so let me take a step back. Basically, the appeals court ruling said, we're not lifting the temporary restraining order on the travel ban because it's likely the case that the government has violated due process rights with this travel ban. That's what it said. And the government has not convinced us that the travel ban does not violate due process rights. And the government said, well, maybe we don't think it violates any due process rights, but fine, maybe you might argue, somebody might make the case that it violates the due process rights of green card holders and visa holders, but it clearly doesn't violate due process rights when the travel ban is applied to people who don't live in this country and say have lived in Iran all their life or live in Sudan all their life. Keeping those people out of the country for a few months doesn't violate due process rights because they don't have due process rights. Due process rights are given to people by the Constitution for people who live in this country, not people who are residents of some other country and have always lived there. And the state of Washington says, but the appeals court seemed to agree that, oh no, wait, there's a good argument that when the travel ban is applied to people who live in other countries, and that the travel ban says, hey, people from Iran, you can't come here for a few months, that violates due process rights. And they say it violates due process rights of people in this country. And the state of Washington, and the appeals court seems to agree, says that people in this country have due process rights that are violated by the travel ban when the travel ban applies to people from other country. And their argument is that, well, suppose when the travel ban says, hey, people from Iran, you can't come here for 3 months, that takes a liberty away from people who live in here, for people who live in America, to have people from Iran that they know come and visit them. And since it takes a liberty away from them, they're entitled to due process, which includes like giving an advance notice and having a hearing and stuff like that. And the travel ban didn't do that, so the travel ban violated their due process rights. So that's what a big part, unless the appeals court can give a good response to the government's argument that, well, the part of the travel ban applying to people who live in other countries doesn't violate due process. Unless the appeals court can give a good response to that, then the temporary restraining order should not be allowed to stand for the part of the travel ban that applies to people who live in other countries, which is most of the people it applies to. And as I've just explained, the appeals court gave very scanty defense of their claim that when the travel ban is applied to people who don't live in this country, people in this country have due process rights because of that, which have to be respected. And the only argument the appeals court ruling, I read the ruling, the only argument in the ruling given for the claim that when the Justice Department, when the travel ban is applied to people who live outside this country, people in this country have due process rights because of when that happens, was that the only argument the appeals court gave for this is they said, well, there are these two other Supreme Court cases, Kerry versus Din and Kleindienst versus Mandel. And if you look at those cases, you'll see that there's a good case to be made that people in this country have due process rights when the government says that people in other countries can't come here for a certain amount of time. But what I just did, if you were watching, you can go, and if you weren't, you can go back and see this. What I just did is I explained to you why neither of those Supreme Court rulings gave the support that the appeals court said was being given by those two rulings. Neither of those two rulings, if you actually read the rulings, support the claim that the travel ban, when applied to people from other countries, when the travel ban is applied to people from other countries, people in this country now have due process rights which have to be respected. And as I said, to re-summarize, in Kerry versus Din, 5 of the 9 justices, majority, said when the State Department didn't let, or whoever it was, I believe it was the State Department, yes, because it was Kerry. So when the State Department didn't let an American resident's husband from Afghanistan come to this country, they said, these 5 justices said, either she didn't have any due process rights in that situation, or they said, we're not going to have an opinion on whether she has due process rights. So the majority of justices did not say that an American woman has due process rights when America says that her husband from Afghanistan can't come here, can't immigrate here. So that would seem, that decision, that ruling does not support only 4 of 9 justices agreed with the general point the appeals court was making. 5 of the 9 justices didn't take a ruling on this, and 3 of the 9 justices actually disagree with the appeals court on this. So 5 of the 9 justices in this case did not say what the appeals court was saying that the decision said. And then when it came to Kleindienst versus Mandel, Kleindienst versus Mandel took no stance on whether people in this country have due process rights when the government keeps someone from coming in this country who they want to come and speak to them. The ruling said nothing about that, about whether they have due process rights. So these 2 rulings do not support the claim that if the government takes action to keep somebody from coming to this country, people in this country connected with that person have their liberties violated or have their other right, have their property deprived or whatever, and therefore have due process rights. So the appeals court's ruling, defense of the claim that people in this country have due process rights when the travel ban excludes people from other countries from coming into this country for the first time, that claim is totally inadequately supported, because the sum total of the support given for that claim the appeals court ruling gives is citing these 2 Supreme Court rulings, and if you actually look at the rulings, it doesn't support the appeals court claim. And that's the entire argument. It's not like this was one of the arguments the appeals court ruling gave. The appeals court ruling only argued to keep the temporary restraining order on due process grounds. It didn't address the other grounds. Its whole argument is on due process grounds. And if you take away the part of the appeals court ruling that says, oh, well, when the travel ban keeps people from other countries out of this country, people in this country have due process rights that can be violated when that happens and that were violated by the travel ban. If you take that away, they no longer have any argument for saying that the temporary restraining order should still be in effect when applied to people who live outside this country and people without green cards and people without visas. And that's most of the people the travel ban applied to anyway. And honestly, I think the government, if you look at what it said in its briefings, they would have been cool with it not applying to green card holders and visa holders, because the real target here was restricting immigration on people who aren't lawful residents of this country already. So the way I see it, this ruling, it's the really big part of the ruling is that it kept the temporary restraining order in effect on the whole travel ban, and kept the travel ban from being enforced on people who live outside this country and don't have green cards and don't have visas. But its argument for doing so is just utterly flawed, and I have explained to you why that is, because its argument for doing so is just citing 2 Supreme Court cases, and if you actually look at the 2 Supreme Court decisions as they're written, they don't support the appeals court in the way the appeals court says those rulings support the appeals court. Okay, so that is my opinion on why, my legally opinion on why the appeals court ruling was flawed. I am not a lawyer, by the way. So if you are a lawyer or you're an expert on this kind of stuff and you have a problem with that, feel free. You can always email me. You can direct message me on Twitter. I'm at Lookner on Twitter, at Lookner. I'm Steve Lookner, by the way. So if you go to Twitter, at Lookner, at Lookner, you can direct message me. Follow me if you'd like to, because I'm always happy to have more followers. But you can also just direct message me and say, I don't agree with you because of this. But I'm just a concerned citizen who felt like I wanted to spend some time and actually look at these rulings for myself and read them and see what they said. And from what I see, the appeals court's ruling is not convincing. And now when I hear many people, respected people, say, oh, well, I think that the appeals court, if it goes to the Supreme Court, the appeals court might very well lose this. And some people who are respected have said, yeah, the appeals court would lose this in the Supreme Court. Supreme Court would go against the appeals court. I now see for myself why they're saying that, at least one point why they're saying that. So, okay, so while I've been going through all this, I have not had, because I am not like a robot and can't do two things at once, in the sense I've not been able to read your comments. So before I finish, I first of all would like to say thank you for everyone who has watched this. I appreciate you watching it. Thank you to the moderators for moderating the chat. Thank you, and just thank you for being willing to delve into some of the legal stuff. I thought, I didn't know if people would be into that, but I thought, hey, maybe it was fun for me to get into it, so maybe it's fun for you. But I'd love to, if you want to ask me any questions right now, it was, and some people say they're getting a bad feed, but it's not bad on my end. So normally if it's a bad connection on my end, it'll say that. So you might want to close your browser and reopen it if you're getting a bad feed. So, but before we sign off here, I'd like to take a few minutes to take some questions or comments if you have them. Even if you don't have questions, if you just have comments, send them to me. So because I have my desktop here, I can try to read your comments as they're scrolling by, but feel free in the next few minutes to send me comments at, just send it to me at Lookner on Twitter, at Lookner. Send me direct messages, because if you comment directly in the chat room, it scrolls by really fast and I don't have that much time to read it and I might miss it. So a couple of people sent me messages, and I want to just see. Norway, you asked me a question about circuit courts, which I'll write back to you later, but I want to sort of, I'm not sure if you were watching this feed or not, so I'm not sure if it's relevant to this feed. So I want to just take questions let people ask questions about this specific feed, if people have them. So hold on, I just want to see what other people asked. All right, so this looks like stuff from before. Let me see if there are other comments here. Oh, Norway, you were watching. Thank you for saying that. So, okay, so Norway for now. So Norway, let me get your question for now. So again, if people want to comment or ask questions, please go right now at Lookner on Twitter and at Lookner and direct message me, and I will be happy to read your comment or answer your question on air. Even if you disagree with me, feel free to say it. All right, Norway, what did you have to say here? Let's see. Norway said, could you explain, he just said watching, could you explain the checks and balance relations between the Congress, President of the United States, and Supreme Court, and why circuit courts isn't a part of that triangle of checks and balances? Well, I would argue that the circuit court is a part of that triangle. So, the checks and balances triangle is between executive branch, legislative branch, and judicial branch. The judicial branch contains the district courts, the circuit courts, which are the appeals courts, and the Supreme Court. Those are the three levels of federal courts. And so as you saw, look, the federal court and the appeals, we saw the federal court came out with a temporary restraining order on the president's executive order. That's an example of a check on presidential power by the judicial branch. The circuit court affirmed the district court's ruling, and that's a continuation of the check power on the presidential branch. So I would see both the circuit court and the district court actions here as part of the check and balance on the executive branch that the entire judicial branch has. So that's the check and balance is not between the Supreme Court and the other two branches. It's between the judicial branch, which includes the Supreme Court, the circuit court, and the district courts, and all of the and the other two branches. So that's my answer to your question, Norway. Good question, though. Thank you. Let's see if there are other comments or messages here. And maybe I'll also just look at if people are making comments before I sign off. I am happy to address them. So the floor is open for comments. Either direct message me at @Lookner, or you can just type them in the chat and I will look. And if no one has any, I will cry. No, I won't cry, but I'll sign off soon if no one has any. And right now, I get comments in bursts. So there's a bit of a lull in the comments, so I will see if there are more. I am waiting here to see. No comments I'm seeing. I'm seeing no comments. I'm going to give it another minute. Oh, there's some comments. Was the initial ban for 3 months? That's from David Ha. So there were 3 parts to the initial travel ban. Let's see if I can get these right. One part said no refugees from anywhere for 120 days. One part said no refugees from Syria indefinitely, and one part said no immigrants at all, no people at all from 7 countries for 90 days. That's the part that was for 3 months, 90 days. And those 7 countries are, I'm going to look them up because I always get them, I don't remember all 7. I think it's Iran, Iraq, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, Yemen, and one other. Which one did I miss? Iran, Iraq, Libya. Libya was the last one I missed. Those 7 countries, no people from those countries for 90 days. So that's the answer to your question, Kevin. Other questions. Somebody just, I think, sent me an email. So let me go to that and see. Or sent me a message. And I see Ellis says, if Congress passed a travel ban bill, could the federal government cover... All right, Ellis, I missed your comment. It faded out after 2 seconds. Why did Cookie Babes wants to know, why did the DHS, Department of Homeland Security, follow the court order? Well, under our law, the court has the authority to give this order, temporary restraining order, and it is supposed to be followed by the executive branch. If the Department of Homeland Security was to not follow that court order, basically they're saying the Constitution doesn't matter anymore. And that would be a dangerous thing because that would set a precedent for anyone to violate the Constitution. So the Department of Homeland Security might disagree with the court's decision, but at the same time, they agree with the Constitution should be the law of the land. The Constitution says the courts have this power, so that's why they kept enforcing it. Let's see. I'm looking, but thank you, Cookie Babes, for the question. Are there other comments or questions? You can, if you like to, you can go to @Lookner and direct message me, but I'm reading some here as well, so I'm just going to see if there are any ones come up. And again, thank you for watching. I'm happy that you've spent some time with me discussing this today. I can say this. I don't think anyone in the mainstream media is covering this in such legal detail, so happy to be able to bring this to you. And I would encourage you, by the way, go online and read the rulings. They can get a little legalese, but the trick is to find the relevant parts. And so for the state of Washington versus Trump, where the appeals court ruling is, the relevant part is really only from page 19 to page 24. If you just read that, you'll be able to follow what they said about and why they argued against Trump's side in this case. So I would encourage you to go look at that stuff. Norway, you have another comment. Norway, you say, justice is supposed to be blind. How can political rulings like this be prevented in the future? And doesn't purely political ruling like this undermine the trust in the justice system? Well, to play devil's advocate, Norway, I think the court would say we didn't give a political ruling. We gave a ruling based on the law. And if you read our ruling, it doesn't talk about politics. It talks about the law. Now, personally, as I just explained, I don't think their ruling was good law, just for the reasons I explained. But at least nominally, they're still acting on the basis of the law, not their political leanings. Now, you might think, and some people do think, that these judges and judges in general sometimes, whether consciously or unconsciously, are affected by their political leanings, and their political leanings come first, and then they craft their rulings to agree with their political leanings. I don't know, enough about that, whether that's the case. I like to think that the vast majority of judges, if not all judges, make a good faith effort to do the law first and not let their political leanings get at hand. But people might disagree with that, and that's fine. But I mean, I think, if you say, how can we prevent these kind of rulings from happening in the future? So, I think, as a citizen, I think all you can do to prevent rulings you think are bad is to get your word out as to why you think those rulings are bad. So, if you think rulings are bad, write a blog post and explain why they're bad. That's sort of part of what I'm doing today. At least, if nothing else, I've explained why I think the ruling is bad. So even if it's not appealed to the Supreme Court, I've let some other people hear that. And maybe if there's, bad rulings out there and you can explain why they're bad, that makes people hold the court to a better standard or something like that. But, these people, they are smart people, these judges. So, I just don't think this specific ruling itself was great law. So, but a good question, and people have different opinions about the politics of all this. But, I think at a certain point, it's unless you have like a mind reader, if you have like a mind scanning device, you can't really be sure what's going on in somebody's head. So I think, for our court system, if we're going to have these judges, it's just like jurors, too. It's the same thing with jurors. Like, jurors are supposed to rule on the basis of the law and not on their political leanings. Does that always happen? Probably not. But, I like to think that jurors make a good faith effort to apply the law and not go with their gut on how they feel, who they like more or something like that. But, that's part of our system. So that's our system, and we sort of rely on good faith of people to apply the law and not just go with their feelings and make the law decisions match their political leanings. But a good question, Norway. Okay, I see some more messages. Hold on a second. Other comments. We have Jacqueline said, Duke, I agree, but I don't know what Duke said. Hypothetically, if the travel ban remained, so just so you know. What's happening on my window now is I believe these are comments from the chat. When they come up, they're coming up in my window for all of 1.5 seconds. So it's very hard for me to read them because they're disappearing very quickly. So I'm going to go back to, I'll keep looking. Highlight switch, how are you? I'll keep looking, but if I apologize if you make a comment in the chat and I can't see it because it's going by so fast and I have so little time to read it. So I'm going to go back. A better way to reach me while I'm taking questions and comments and sharing them with all of you is to go to @Lookner on Twitter, @LOOKNER, and direct message me there. Oh, sorry. Somebody says get a water glass. Freedom isn't free says doesn't like my water bottle. Yeah, I should have done this with a water glass. Thank you. I will. I have one here. In the future, I will do that. It is slurping, isn't it? Wow, I didn't realize it made the slurping sound. Okay, fair enough complaint. Duly noted. I will have a water glass next time. Super Monkey News says, can the president rescind this executive order and execute a new executive order that incorporates this due clause process? Oh, yes. So the president can issue a new executive order, and I believe the president can rescind this one. And that is something the president might do. But I don't know what's going to happen here. It's possible that the president would issue a new executive order, but not rescind this one if President Trump thinks he's going to win in the Supreme Court. Maybe just for the sake of it, he will let this appeal. He will appeal this to the Supreme Court. But there's reasons to not appeal to the Supreme Court, because if you lose in the Supreme Court, by some chance, even if President Trump thinks he's going to win, maybe that affects maybe that for various reasons is bad for him, bad for his administration. So, but he can rescind this and issue a new executive order. He can keep this in effect and issue a new executive order which adds to this or modifies this. So there's all those possibilities out there. It'll be very interesting to see what happens on the next few days, next week or so, because there have been hints that they are working on doing this. So we'll see what happens. So good question from Super Monkey News. We have another message from Leo D. Brown. Leo D. Brown says, the ruling never addressed the letter of the law when dealing with the restraining order as it pertains to the travel ban, and the letter of the law regarding that aspect either. This is the main reason it is flawed. So Leo D. Brown, that is Leo D. Brown's view. Thank you. The letter of the law dealing with the restraining order. Leo D. Brown says the ruling never addressed the letter of the law when dealing with the restraining order as it pertains to the travel ban and the letter of the law. Oh, so I think what you might be saying, Leo D. Brown, is that when the Trump administration issued this travel ban, they very clearly cited a certain law that they said gave them the authority to do so. I think it's U.S. Code 1182, but there's like a number before that. Like the part of the code, is it 81182? I'm not sure. Go look it up if you want to, what the specific laws they cited. And as Leo D. Brown points out rightly, and a bunch of critics of the ruling have pointed out rightly, this was an important part of the Trump administration's case of the travel ban and their justification of the travel ban. And this was literally, this code 1182 was literally never mentioned in the ruling. And a number of people have a big problem with the appeals court ruling because it never mentioned this code on which the Trump administration justified their travel ban ruling. So I didn't bring that up today because it was a little bit of a tangential issue to the specific point I was making, but perfectly good point to make, and I leave it to you to discuss that more. Okay, thank you, Leo D. Brown, for that comment. We had a comment from Cookie Babe said, "Can the left take every executive order to court to tie Trump up?" So the left has to have this thing called standing. So the Constitution says that the federal court system can only decide cases and controversies. So cases and controversies has been taken to mean it can only decide cases where a party that has been harmed or directly affected by someone or some entity sues that entity. So what that means is in this country, if say I read in a newspaper an article where I think Microsoft harmed some other company. If I have no connection with the other company, I can't file a suit against Microsoft. To file a suit in this country, in federal court, you have to be somehow affected by the entity you're suing against. You can't just be some random person. So the left can only file lawsuits when executive orders affects them at all, but they can come up with creative arguments to argue that they are affected by a certain executive order. And this is when you successfully argue that you are affected by a certain action and you have the right to bring suit. That is called standing. You might have heard this term. So having standing is having the legal right to bring a lawsuit. You can only have a legal right if you've shown that you're affected by the entity you're suing, what they've done. So the left can, in this case, some people would say, well, the left came up with a creative argument that they have standing, which is that they argued that Washington residents are affected when the travel ban excludes people living in other countries from coming here because, for example, they can't have their residents come visit them. Therefore, since Washington residents are harmed, the state of Washington has standing to sue the Trump administration, the Justice Department, Trump administration over their, and whoever else is on the lawsuit, over their travel ban. So if the left can come up with creative ways that the court system will buy to argue that they have standing, then they can, if they want, sue the government to try to stop these executive orders. And some people think they're going to do that a lot. We'll see if it happens. Good question, Cookie Babes. Okay, I have time for a few more comments and questions. Thank you again so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. I didn't know if anybody would want to be with this live stream today. So really appreciate you all sticking with it and joining me. It's been really fun to do. Excellent questions and comments as usual. Thanks again to the moderators. As I said before, really appreciate them moderating your chat and having it be a safe, fun place to chat, although I don't want to say a safe space because for obvious reasons. So for a few minutes, if there's other questions people want to ask, you can either direct message me at Lookner, at Lookner, or try to, if you'd like, say them here. And if you want to also just say hello, feel free to do that. Oh, they're going by so fast. Rabbit Hop X says, I think we can chainsaw Washington State from the continent and send them out to sea. That is Rabbit Hop X's view. Any other comments you'd like to make while we are still here? Linda Hall says, Norway, honestly, I think the court is cooking their own goose. They already beyond the law. Duke said something, but Duke disappeared, so I can't see Duke anymore. Your comment. Any other comments you want to say about this? Couple minutes longer, we'll go. Couple minutes. What else? I'll give it like a minute more and see if anybody has other comments. So get them in now, because I love to hear your feedback and like to hear what you're thinking about. And what else do I have to say? Oh, yeah, so I do think, I will say this, a lot is going to be happening on this court stuff. And so, for example, if the president, and we at Right Side will bring you breaking news. So even on the weekend, if we hear that some breaking news is happening with this, we will come on live, and even if it's a live stream. So today I wasn't in the office, so we couldn't do the thing with the nice set and everything, so I just did it from home. But we will come on and broadcast live and bring you breaking news when it happens. Even if it's the middle of the night, if I wake up in time. I'm happy to do it. Cookie Babe says, Snowden versus Assange, what is the difference? So Snowden... The really brief answer I'll give to this question is Snowden was somebody in America who took these secrets out of from the place that they were hidden in and gave them to Assange, and then Assange published them. That's the difference. But a little off topic, which isn't a problem necessarily, but we're going to finish up here. Last few comments. Okay, last couple comments before I gotta go. I haven't eaten anything in a long time, so I'm gonna go eat something. I hope you're enjoying your day so far and are doing fun stuff this weekend. You know, whatever it is you're doing from wherever you are. Often people are from different countries, so if you're in a different country, if it's at night where you are, hope you're having a good time. Duke says food. Nonimo, None53 says thanks for your time. Thanks for your time watching. I am Alexander says I can see liberals using the courts to buck Trump at everything. I wish your comments would say on the. I wonder if I can see your comments up here. Hold on. I have a little. Just Hap says, good info, thanks, Steve. Thank you for watching, Just Hap. Maybe I can go to the Right Side page on YouTube. Duke, you do a great job, Steve. Thank you, Duke. You do a great job watching. Jay Pohl, why didn't the other presidents get sued? Well, Obama did get sued for certain things he did. I don't know the exact ones, but you can look that up. Let's see here. I'm just looking up to see if I can find on Right Side Broadcasting here. Sorry, RSBN. I'm wondering if I can open up the chat myself, I can see your comments a little better, because when I see them on my iPad, they go by so fast. Oh, here we go. Okay, hold on. Can I see the chat? Oh, I see. Okay, now I can see your chat a little better. Hold on. So I'm sort of looking at the chat and looking at you. So I'll take a couple more questions. Oh, gosh, let's see. Lizard's Layers 1 says the left is buying everything, major corruption in the system. Music World says ignoring my comment. It's weird. In the chat room, when I'm looking at the chat room on the YouTube page, which I just opened up on my desktop, I can see the comments a lot better, and they go slower. The YouTube app, for some reason that I'm using, I don't get all of your comments on the screen. So when I read the comments on the screen, I don't get all of them, and some of them go by very fast. So that's why I apologize if you made a comment or question and I didn't read it, because a lot of them I just didn't see. Let's see. Any other ones here I didn't get to? Let's see. Sheila Deal says, thank you very much, Stephen RSBN. You're welcome, Sheila Deal. Jacqueline O says, go eat. I'm going to go eat very soon. Thank you. Bub's Love had a question for Norway, so I won't read that. Gooey Gooball says, Steve, thank you for the excellent explanation. You're welcome. I really appreciate you watching, and I hope it was helpful. So that's why I do it. If no one was watching and it wasn't entertaining and helpful to people, there would be no reason for me to do it. So I appreciate you saying that. I am Alexander says, currently you have 9 courts of 11 that have liberal majority, mainly stacked by Obama, using the nuclear option set by Reid. That was I am Alexander's comment. Let's see here. Other comments as I go back and see. We have Lizard's Lair says, when are you going to go live again? So I will do it when breaking news warrants, and when news warrants. This felt like when this decision happened, I started looking over the decision just out of curiosity. And when I realized that there was this case to be made that it was a flawed decision, I thought, well, that's a good reason to go live. So I'm not going to go live and barrage you all day, every day. But when stuff comes up and I think it's either breaking news or some big point comes up and it's warranted, I will go live again. So I will let you know. And I didn't tweet out today on the RSBN Twitter because there was a little bit of an issue with the Twitter today. But in the future, if I know I'm going to go live, I'll try to give you a heads up in advance. Oh, Norway says hit like a bunch of times. Thank you, Norway, for saying that. Norway, thank you for all the support. Let's see. Lynn Jean says thank you for choosing RSBN. Yeah, thank you for choosing RSBN. I agree with you. Keck Fug, and then Slunder Schmuck. Another word I won't want to say. Kong Victor Derp says, dude, are you the owner of Right Side? I love your channel. I am not the owner of Right Side. Right Side's founder and CEO is Joe Seals, but I'm glad you love the channel, so thanks for saying that. Shanta James says, Steve, you do a great job, but tired of you saying Trump. It is President Trump. I know. I really, just so you know, Shanta, I try to say President Trump, and sometimes I forget, and I don't catch myself, so I apologize. Also, sometimes I'll say Milo instead of Milo, and I try to correct myself there. So I apologize if I say that wrong. I do try, and I'm aware of it, so note well taken. Christine Burton says, can the Sergeant at Arms hold them accountable? I'm not sure, Christine Burton. I might have missed the first part of your question. Lauren Caddo says, it's great that you answer questions. Thank you so much. It's great that you ask questions, and I'm happy to do it. Couple more. All right, I have 5 more minutes, and I got to go eat. 5 more minutes, and then I would love to sit here. If I didn't have to go eat, I would go and do this, but you do not want to see me hungry. It would be bad news. Let's see. Other questions. Scott Poller says, no mainstream media. I think you're making a general comment that you don't want to watch the mainstream media, and you know, I think alternatives to mainstream media, good. Let's have more alternatives out there. We have, Scott Poller, RSBN is hands down the best source for your news. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate it. Jacqueline O says mainstream media sucks. It's funny though, so I do realize that you can see these comments, although maybe some people are watching with the comments off. So I just want to, but I like reading them anyway. Kirsty James says it's your birthday. Happy birthday, Kirsty James. Oh, and just so you should know this, you might say, well, Steve, when you're on and you're doing a broadcast from like the RSBN set, why don't you just look at the chat room there? Like, there's no easy way for me to look at the chat room when I'm on the RSBN set doing stuff, because I would have to have like a big monitor right in front of my face, which I couldn't realistically do. Here at home, I can have my desktop monitor right next to the iPad and I can do it. So I apologize, I can't. That's why when I do when I do some kind of broadcast from the studio, I can't really take your questions from the chat room, because there's really no easy way of me of seeing them. So when I do a broadcast from the studio, the way to reach me is to either email me or go to @Lookner and direct message me. So just because I can see your chat comments here now, don't think I can see them when we're broadcasting from the studio, and don't think I'm ignoring you. And I should really quickly just check if anyone emailed, so I didn't ignore any questions via email. Let's see. We have, Diane Birch wrote, thank you for taking the time to provide us with your insights and knowledge on this matter. Unlike the liberal media, you are a true professional. You care about our country and want to report the truth. Thank you. We are blessed with you. Thank you, Diane Birch, so much for saying that. I do this, and we do this for all of you out there. So when you write and say you're enjoying it and you're getting something out of it, that's really important to us, because you're why we do it. Okay, let's say 2 more minutes, and that's it. Then I have to make myself go eat. We have... Happalia says, why don't you put the chat in slow mode? But the problem if I put it in slow mode, Happalia, is then if there is a slow mode, everything's delayed. And so I want to be able to hear what you're asking in real time about what I'm saying at the current time. But if I see like a question come up from 15 minutes ago and I don't remember what it is I was talking about, it might be confusing. So I got to stick with, I like to stick with the current speed of stuff. Even if there is a slow mode, and I don't know if there is. Arc Tesla says, was it real expensive in D.C.? Well, the hotels were insanely expensive the week of the inauguration because they could just charge whatever they wanted, because there was a limitation. There was a limit of hotels in actually close to the Congress and close to where everything was going on. It wasn't so bad if you got a little ways outside the hotel. It was a little more expensive, but I don't think it was like, the town itself, I don't think they like raised food prices and stuff at restaurants. I think it was more the hotels that were really expensive there. Let's see. Full Kit Wanker says, I am not for Trump, I am in Ivanka. Don Damron says, Steve, have RSBN turn on the closed caption settings for YouTube videos. Much easier for those who cannot hear too great. So unfortunately, I don't know for sure, Don Damrun, but I think to have closed captioning, like you have to be like a certain, you have to have like a certain, like networks have it because like they have somebody either do it or the closed captioning people do it for them. You have to have somebody do it for you, like a human. Like the YouTube itself, I don't believe automatically can close caption stuff. At least that's what I know, what I think I know. So it'd be great if we had somebody closed captioning our stuff, but like if we were a bigger network, I think that would happen automatically, but it doesn't happen right now. So I apologize. There's no closed captioning going on. I don't believe. And now maybe somebody can correct me that there is some sort of closed captioning where like the computer can recognize what I'm saying or something. Maybe that can happen. If so, shoot me an email at steve.lookner@rsbn.tv and let me know. All right, one more minute, then I gotta go and eat. Let's see. Are there any? Somebody says just answer Music Worlds, but I didn't see Music Worlds' question. Ray says, bro, we can read, just answer the questions. Thanks. Ray, I like to read the comments once in a while just to, I know, you know what, it's a habit, Ray. So part of the reason I'm reading the comments now is I like to acknowledge you guys. And so reading your comments is a way of me acknowledging your participation. But part of the reason I'm reading as well is that reading the comments to the questions is I'm so used to normally when I broadcast, I'm in the studio. And at that point, I like to, I'm reading stuff that you've sent me rather than stuff in the chat room. Stuff that you've sent me to read because I don't have access really to the chat room. So long story short, this is what happens when I get hungry. I don't explain well. I get that you want me to focus on people's comments when I'm here. People's questions and not their comments because you can read the comments. So I was trying to give you a little bit of a shout out by reading people's comments too. Let's see. All right, Wolf. Thank you, Wolf, for saying have good food. Christine Burton says, thanks. You're welcome, Christine. All right, so I'm going to right now, because I got to go, I'm going to sign off now. Thank you so much for watching. This has been really fun to do. And I really like that we were able to do like I want to say nerdy, but nerdy has bad implications. I think nerdy in a good way. We were able to do a program where we talked about like very specific legal stuff. And we got, unlike the mainstream media has to summarize everything in 3 minutes and doesn't get into big details about stuff. We do a program where we can get into the details and put together like and I can make a good like detailed case. Forget all the superficial stuff. A detailed case of why I think that the appeals court went wrong in this ruling and had a problem with it. And I had a problem with it. And so hopefully that was enjoyable to you. I appreciate you all joining me. If more news comes out this weekend, I'm happy to do another live stream. I sort of want to do maybe a live stream. If this immigration thing, these immigration raids keeps blowing up and it becomes a big deal, my impression now from stuff I've read is that like the immigration raids right now are like roughly speaking the same type of thing that was going on during the Obama administration, but it's being covered as if it's like this whole new thing. So if that stuff gets like a crazy amount of coverage and it's this big crisis, maybe I'll do another live stream this weekend. But if any breaking news comes up, I'm happy to do it, and we will keep covering breaking news here at Right Side for you. But for now, thank you so much for joining. Thanks to the mods for moderating. Thank you for watching. Thank you for all your comments and questions. Thank you for putting up with me drinking out of a water bottle rather than a glass. I'll try to get a glass next time. I really appreciate it. You're the reason we do all this stuff. Have a great weekend, and I will see you all soon. Thank you so much for joining. I'll talk to you soon. Goodbye.